You know, the majority of my life was spent living in the United States of America. And during that time of living there, I took a couple trips to Europe. Now, my first trip to Europe was unforgettable. I went to Finland, and I just remember thinking, this place is absolutely amazing, right? I just felt like I was in alternative reality. And ever since I went on that trip, the thought of living in Europe was always in my mind. Every time I would leave Europe and go back to the US, I had this desire in my heart and the sadness that, man, I just love Europe and I wish I was there. You know, I'd look on Instagram and on the internet and on YouTube of all these videos and pictures of Europe. Well, if we fast forward a couple years later, I got the chance to move to Norway. Now, it didn't just happen like that, right? I actually was going to Norway just to visit, right? I didn't have any plans of moving there. I didn't have any plans of staying there. I honestly thought I would go back to the US. But after spending 2 weeks in Norway, I fell in love with the country. Now, the real reason was my fiance was there, so I was going to live with her. But the idea of living in Norway just stuck with me. And I was thinking every day, I think this place is just amazing, right? I remember the first time I arrived in Norway, just getting off the train from the airport and just feeling like this place is on another level, right? Everything, just the way that the society runs in general. And I think this is a common theme you see on the internet. You know, you see people talking about how much better the quality of life is in Europe and specifically Norway, right? And I got to see it firsthand. And I think there's a couple things that I want to point out because now I'm actually in the United States of America visiting, right? I haven't realized the differences between these two places until I actually returned to the US. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the noise level. So when I entered the airport in the US and I exited outside, I just remember seeing so much noise, honking, people screaming, you know, the buses, everything moves so quickly. Now you compare this to Norway where it's just like two different worlds. You know, Norway is quiet, calm. You hear no one honking, no one even making a noise. Everyone is just so calm. And I just could not believe the differences these two places have regarding the people and the noise, because noise is something I never noticed in the US, right? Yeah, you notice that people are loud, but I thought that was normal. I never knew that, hey, other countries, people are silent and they're not always being energetic and screaming and going crazy and honking, you know, especially in the majority of cities in the US. That is, especially New York, that is extremely common. You know, leading on with the next point, I think something else that I noticed was how the cities are built. I think one of the best benefits of living in Norway is the ability to take public transportation and walk everywhere. Because in the US, you're going to struggle if you don't have a car. So public transportation was something I never really took. Because in the US, the majority of people, they don't take public transportation. Almost everyone has a car because you need a car, right? I remember looking up how far it would be for me to go to a grocery store, and it said almost 4 hours walking, which is like, that's just impossible, right? You need a car to operate in the US. Sure, you can take public transportation, but I feel like in the US, it's not the greatest, right? It's run down sometimes, not the cleanest. You know, you have some interesting people on there and interesting scenarios that you might find yourself in. And I never experienced this in Europe, right? When I went to Norway for the first time, I remember going on the public transportation and I could not believe what I was seeing. Everyone was super calm. Public transportation was modern, clean, efficient. And I think this is one of the best benefits of living in Europe, literally, especially Norway, because you don't need a car. You don't need to pay that extra monthly payment, the insurance, which can be a lot, gasoline, and it's what the majority of people take, right? I feel like European cities are not built for cars, literally, especially Norway is not built for cars. Of course, if you live in a rural area, you're gonna need a car. And people don't take cars. And then I remember in California, I just never really took it. I never really wanted to take it because I had this idea in my head that it's the same as the US, right? And then I went to Europe and I was like, now I see why people live here. Now I see why people love Europe. The stores. The stores is something that I never really understood, right? Being in the US and growing up here, you know, living here, you get used to the size of the stores, right? You know, Walmart, Target, that becomes the norm for you. And all the different options in the grocery stores, that's just normal to you, you know? You go into the grocery store, you'll pick between a ton of different options, you know, take you a while. and then you'll leave, And I always thought, hey, this is probably normal. But since I went to Norway and the first grocery store I went to, I just could not believe what the difference was. I honestly thought at first I went to a store called Joker, by the way, which is a grocery shop in Norway. And at first I thought maybe this is just one grocery store that, is small and people really don't go to. But then as I went to more and more grocery stores, I realized people are not overeating here and they're not buying food in excessive amounts, right? You won't have many options in Norway, but there will be amazing options, healthy, organic, even locally sourced, right? And it's like, this really opens your mind because you see the idea that grocery stores are not supposed to be these ginormous, malls basically with 100 different options. Grocery stores are supposed to be places where you get healthy, organic, fresh food. And when I first went into Joker in Norway, I just remember being like in shock because one, the store is very, very small and you only have a couple options, of the same brands, but it makes shopping so much easier, efficient, and quick. The fact that Norway nails, and most of Europe nails, this food is just makes me feel so good at heart and makes me want to live there and be like, I want to be surrounded by all this amazing food. So, if you don't eat so well, then that'll lead to complications, which will ultimately lead you to needing healthcare. Now, this is another one of those differences between Norway and US that is just incredible. So me growing up in California, the healthcare was always very interesting to me because one, you would need health insurance, which would cost quite a lot of money. And then two, you need to still pay for the doctor visits every time you would go. And don't forget, if you don't have health insurance and something happens to you and you need to go to the hospital, you are in for a treat, let me tell you that, because the healthcare prices or the prices of going to the hospital without insurance will throw you off financially for a very, very long time. So that's why health insurance is key in the US. And I remember going to Europe, Norway, and the first time that my fiance went to the the doctor for a checkup, I remember I went with her and I thought, oh, she's gonna have to pay a lot of money, right? It's gonna cost her a lot. But no, she only paid $30. You don't even have to pay for health insurance. Can you believe that? $30 and no health insurance. And I was just like, is this real? Like, are you kidding me? You don't have to pay for health insurance. And every time you go to the doctor or the hospital, you pay the same price every time. It doesn't change because, something I observed in the US is they'll always tell you like, this is an estimate of the cost, right? This is not the final cost. And then at the end, you're going to find all these hidden fees that you never knew about. So the price will change every time you go, right? But in Norway, it's like it's the same every time. I mean, this is unbelievable, right? To an American who, never really understood the European system until now. It's like, now I realize why people love going to Europe and living there, especially Norway, because I also heard that there was a couple comments in one of my videos where people were talking about how they had to pay nothing for hospital visits. And, to go to the hospital, it was basically free. And they even give you money to transport you from your house to the hospital. And I'm like, we don't have that in the US. So I think this is one of the most important differences between Norway and the US and something that I understand why people talk about so much. Something that really stood out to me was the branding and advertising between Norway and the US. And in Norway, after being there for almost 8 months, the branding and advertising is very, very minimal in Norway, right? I barely have seen any ads, just when I'm walking or outside. Even just in general, the advertising is very limited in the country. And then coming to the US, oh my God, let me tell you, this is on a different level, right? Everywhere you go, there's some sort of advertising on taxis, outside, the billboards. I think that's something that really gets me is the billboards, because in Norway, you don't see any billboards, but here they're everywhere. And there's just so much advertising that you have a trouble focusing because you want to buy all these things. You're like overstimulated by a ton of different ads. And it really does make you wonder, like, why is there so much advertising? In Norway, people don't buy a lot of things. They just buy the things they need. And then in the US, you have people, overbuying all these things because of the ads. And I was just like, across Europe, advertising is pretty limited, right? I mean, you'll see it on the TV and stuff, but in terms of in person, it's not that, widespread. That was something that really, really intrigued me, right? coming back to the US after being in Norway for a while. Walking is something that Norway absolutely nails, and I think this is another benefit or difference that is just so amazing about Europe, right? In the US, walking is not really that common, especially to go to the grocery store or the gym. People will take a car, take a taxi. You won't see that many people walking, unless, of course, you live in a major city like New York, LA, San Francisco. People will be walking. But I just feel like people aren't out as much as in Europe, especially Norway. Norway, people are literally out all the time. When I tell you all the time, I mean that. Rain, dark, sun, snow, all types of weather. They're always out, they're always doing things. And the ability to just walk through the city is just amazing, right? You get to walk, see all this beautiful architecture, right? And I feel like that's something that the US doesn't really offer. But then you have the factor of it being very busy and things going on all the time. And I think the fact that Norway is just so peaceful and there's barely anyone that is not walking, which is amazing. You know, even though people are walking, it's still so calm. There's a ton of people walking. It's still so calm. And to a grocery store that was far away, you would take a car. Or if you were going to go to the gym, you take a car. You know, everything, you take a car. But since coming to Norway, you know, I was really hesitant at first to walk. But then I realized this is actually really amazing, right? And it just gives you this sense of peace. It's just incredible. So I think that's something that makes living in Europe so amazing. So yeah, guys, I think those are some of the biggest differences that I've noticed between Europe and the US, especially after being back in the US. And since I've lived in the US for so long, I always thought that these were normal, right? People not taking public transportation or the grocery stores being large. But it wasn't until I stepped out of my comfort zone, moved all the way across the world without even knowing I was going to move across the world. I honestly thought I would come back to the US. But still, I did that, and that was really what burst the bubble and was like, opened my eyes to this entirely different world that didn't feel real at first. I really loved being in Europe, and I do now. I honestly think it's one of the greatest places to live on this earth. Of course, there's other places in the world. I'm not just saying Europe. But for me, Europe really nails it in a lot of the things that I was looking for. Now, of course, things could be improved like in any country. I think everyone should experience living in Europe and Norway in their life. So yeah, this was really eye-opening. You know, there's a lot more differences I can talk about. Thank you guys for watching. This one's a little bit of a long video. Let me know if you like this type of video. And with that being said, I'm still jet lagged. It's been 5 days, maybe 6 days since I've been here. Brutal. But I hope to get over it soon. Make sure you subscribe, leave a comment. And with that being said, I'm going to once again go take a nice nap.